episode is on the United Kingdom, a country that has had 7 prime ministers in 10 years.
Yeah, so in this episode, we are gonna discuss why are there so many prime ministers in the UK in the past 10 years? And we're gonna also gonna discuss some local British politics as well as some part about international relationship, that about the special relations and the Brexit, which has haunted the United Kingdom since I think 2016. And so before of that, I think we should do a brief recap of what the United Kingdom has experienced in the past 10 years. So as we just said, the United Kingdom has 7 prime ministers during this period. So as we can see, the first prime minister is David Cameron. He won in 2010. The 2010 election was not really a landslide. I think it was a hung parliament for David Cameron and the Conservative Party. So before David Cameron, it was a Labour in government, and it was Gordon Brown. And Gordon Brown, because of the Great Recession and because the economics is performing bad, and because of also partly because of UK's prolonged involvement in Middle Eastern wars, and he grew increasingly unpopular, and the Conservatives gained the popularity in the 2010 election. But as we said, the election was a hung parliament, and Conservatives did not have a majority, so it was actually a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats Party, which is kind of a smaller party in the that stands left of the Conservative but right of the Labour Party, so right in the middle, that is led by Nick Clegg at the moment. And so David Cameron, he did a lot of policies during his government, which includes social welfare. So I think one prominent social welfare that he did was he tried to reduce welfare and increase incentives for people to work, because I think there might have been a budget deficit following the Great Recession. And it was also kind of a market-based supply-side policy in order to boost the economy by getting more people to work. And as we said, he entered the government with the Liberal Democrats, which is a junior party. And one of the Liberal Democrats' campaign promises was to hold an alternative vote, whether you call it a referendum or plebiscite. An alternative vote referendum basically was the Liberal Democrats Party to kind of reform the electoral system in the UK and try to be more proportional rather than benefiting the two major parties. But the 2011 alternative votes, that referendum did not pass, so UK retained its old electoral system. And other policies he did, including the expansion of schools. He built many public schools, and because there's massive education inequality in UK, and you probably heard about Eton, those fancy prestigious public schools in the UK, and so a lot of working class families in the UK did not actually have that good access to education, and he vowed to change that. And perhaps the last major event that happened during his government was the Scottish independence vote, which was a close vote, to be honest. In the vote, the Scottish residents are asked whether they want to remain in UK or whether they want to leave, and I think they voted to remain in the United Kingdom by a very slim margin. But there was a more devastating referendum in 2016 waiting for David Cameron, and that is the Brexit vote. So basically, there was the UK Independence Party, led by Nigel Farage, which is still a very prominent politician in the UK right now. And the UK Independence Party was basically a single issue party that is dedicated to get the United Kingdom out of the European Union. So the party advocated for them to, I think they passed a motion in the parliament, which says the government has to hold a referendum regarding the status of United Kingdom in the European Union, and the Brexit votes, contrary to what most pollsters believed, a slim majority of people actually voted to leave the United Kingdom. In a referendum, roughly about half of the voting population attended. And David Cameron, of course, did not anticipate all of these happening. So he resigned following the Brexit referendum in 2016. And so the next in government, the next prime minister is Theresa May. And he was also an Oxford alumnus. And
She studied geography.
oh, that does not leave a good first impression, I would have to say. And so basically, Theresa May, so after she handed over the seat of the prime minister, she called a snap election. But after which it was still a hung parliament, which means the conservatives did not have a full majority of the government, which makes governing increasingly hard and difficult for her. And I think she somehow entered an informal agreement with a sort of a centrist party in Northern Ireland, but I forgot what the name is, so that doesn't matter. So obviously, David Cameron did not manage to get the Brexit done. So the first priority of Theresa May is definitely to do that. But because everything in the UK have to be passed in the parliament, and as we said, it's a hung parliament, so Theresa May, she did not actually get the Brexit deal done, and her Brexit deal was rejected by Parliament, and so because of that, she also has to resign. And then it was Boris Johnson, which was formerly the mayor of London, the capital of the United Kingdom, and he went in government in 2019, and after that he also called a snap election, sort of in order to give him a clear mandate and to make the government more legitimate. So but in that elections, the conservatives did manage to get a majority of the seats, so it was actually quite good for them. So Boris Johnson, he was actually a very controversial prime minister in the past few years. Um, what's good is that he did manage to get the Brexit done. The final approval of the deal, I think it was in 2020, right? The parliament did finally approve or ratified um the negotiation with European Union. But there are also certain controversies. For example, I think he once tried to dismiss or the parliament in order to get his European Union deal done, which was condemned by the king. Maybe not the king, but certainly condemned by the
The queen.
oh yeah, condemned by the queen and other publics. And so, but after all, the Supreme Court rejected the deal. So that's made him very controversial. And during the COVID-19, where the UK did not perform, I would say did not, well, was not have a really good response toward the uh pandemic. And during lockdowns in UK, there were a Partygate crisis in which there was lockdown, but Boris Johnson seemed to be in a social scene with his friends. So that was also huge controversy that damaged him politically. And yeah, and he's also, I think, said some not entirely scientific quotes during the pandemic. But really, what you made him um resign was a crisis with Chris Pincher, which is the deputy chief whip of the conservative at the time, and he was found to have a sexual misconduct with someone else, and that was clearly not a very good news for Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. So he also had to step down despite leading the United Kingdom through the pandemic and the approval of the European Union deal. And what came after Boris Johnson was Liz Truss. And she basically governed only for 50 days or so. It was a really short-lived premiership. What she tried to do is that she tried to pass a budget. She tried to cut taxes and increase borrowing. And in the aftermath of the pandemic, because she gained the premiership in 2022 and she was trying to boost the economy, but the financial market clearly did not like her move. They saw it as too risky, and the stock market basically collapsed. So she also had to step down. And then, uh, what succeeded her is Rishi Sunak, a Indian prime minister, also an Asian prime minister. That is a first for the United Kingdom. He was an Oxford alumni, which there has been five of them in the past 10 years. Yeah. So yeah, one of the biggest criticism that Rishi Sunak faced is not that he's a bad prime minister, is more of the legacy of the pandemic and the Russo-Ukrainian war, that the United Kingdom is experiencing negative economic growth. So it was really a dark time, and the inflation was also really high. And other policies, he did have an international presence in supporting the Ukraine, and he also formulated a so-called Rwanda asylum plan, which sought to decrease border crossing and deport uh, immigrants back to Rwanda, which is how the name plan got its name. And because the Conservatives has been in power from 2010, and Rishi Sunak governed until 2024, so it was 14 years, and the economy was in bad shape, and people were still upset by the Brexit. So in the 2024 election, the Conservatives lost their popularity, and that's the end of the Conservative rule, and we have a brand new prime minister, which is Keir Starmer. So I think, yeah. Do you have any questions for the history of or this part?
No, I thought that was a very thorough
Mhm.
recap of what has happened in the past 10 years, in the past 14 years of
Yeah,
conservative rule. Yeah, I think when you look at these five conservative prime ministers, I think you could point to some of them as, perhaps bad prime ministers, or prime ministers that made poor decisions. But I think um, altogether, I think, most of them were their premierships were quite difficult because of uh, extraordinary circumstances. Um, I think perhaps it all started with David Cameron's his gamble to call the referendum. I mean, if he didn't call
indeed.
the
Yeah,
referendum, it's not like he was going to get kicked out of office or anything. But he called the referendum, and as Jumbo said, the result was unanticipated for quite a few reasons. I think we'll discuss why Brexit did happen later on. But it happened, and he left because of that. Theresa May left because she couldn't solve it. Boris Johnson, he delivered Brexit, but I think he left. Well, obviously he also had extraordinary circumstances. He found himself in the pandemic, but I think in the end he left office more because of his own actions, because of
yeah,
Partygate
because of
and other
scandals.
scandals.
Yeah,
Yeah, Liz Truss left. Uh, I mean, I guess it wasn't her fault. It was just, policy that didn't work out.
yeah,
So perhaps like it was her fault politically, but I think it wasn't a personal act that eventually doomed her. And honestly, Rishi Sunak, I personally think had Rishi Sunak replaced Boris Johnson directly after Liz Truss, maybe he could have gotten a better opportunity to show the country what he
Mhm.
was doing well, and they may have had more of a hope for a victory, or at least not get defeated so badly in the general election of
Yeah,
2024. But I mean, at that time, basically, no matter what he did, he was going to lose because, I mean, 14 years of conservative rule, as you said, people were fed up with the economy. They were fed up with basically the whole country, how things were going, and of course, they blamed that all on the government at the time, which was the conservative government. So Rishi Sunak, he didn't really have a chance. I think he did quite well. He was obviously quite able. He was Chancellor
he
of the
was very
Exchequer.
handsome. Yeah,
Yeah, he's also very handsome. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer before. And honestly, I think for any minority to reach the highest level in government or in Western countries, they have to be, I think, more able than other people. So, and obviously, Rishi Sunak was very able.
yeah.
Um,
So that's
but
why
he
he's in finance right now. Yeah,
yeah, he was in finance before, I think, as well.
yeah.
Um, and but nothing he could do could save the election. Just like unless Starmer did something horrendous, he was going to win the election either way because people were just going to vote for the next party that wasn't the Conservatives, and that was the Labour Party. Um, yeah, I think for all five of these conservative prime ministers, I watched their resignation speeches because I like to do that, and uh, I think at least Cameron, May, and Rishi Sunak, those these three resignation speeches were very memorable for me. The first two because I think they were quite moving, and Rishi Sunak because I watched it live. I
Okay.
don't really think I have that much of an impression of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, but I think, from what they said in their resignation speeches, you can also see what kind of people they are, or, what was the defining part of their legacy. For example, David Cameron said in his speech, I do not think it would be right for me to be the captain that steers our country to its next
Mhm.
destination, which is obviously alluding to Brexit because he campaigned for Remain, but the referendum obviously didn't didn't yield that result. Theresa May, she also voted for Remain, but in the end she became the captain that steered the country, albeit unsuccessfully at first, to Brexit. And I think her speech was also very moving. I think many people have probably watched it on WeChat or TikTok or these
Mhm.
um, shorts. She was obviously very visibly moved and had tears when she said that uh, I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love. And I think that was actually the first time that I watched a uh, resignation speech, and after that, I watched every single one because I think it truly is a very interesting speech, and yeah, and uh, for Boris Johnson, I don't remember what he said in his speech, but I think his last words in Parliament were "Hasta la vista, baby," which is obviously quite unorthodox. I mean, you can compare it with what Keir Starmer said in his last PMQs, which
Mhm.
was basically, "I've done my all for I've given my all, and I thank everyone, and I love my family, and goodbye." That's basically what he said. But Boris Johnson saying this, which was quite unorthodox, also goes to say quite a bit about his personality and his style. After all,
Yeah. Maybe
Trump
Boris
himself
Johnson would
called,
be, yeah, maybe he would be a good social media politician, I would say.
yeah, he's a journalist right now, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, Rishi Sunak, his speech was also of very high class and very high quality. I don't remember exactly what he said, but I watched it live and I was like, wow, this is a great speech because he really did everything you need to do in a speech. He was gracious, he accepted defeat, he congratulated Keir Starmer, but also he highlighted his legacy, what he did well, and wished the best for the country. And it was a very gracious speech, and I think it was just of very high quality. It was also raining, I think, and people were,
Yeah.
shouting in the background, so it was quite a difficult environment, but I think it was a great speech. Yeah, and yeah, that's basically my view on the five conservative prime ministers.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that David Cameron might have just not voted the Brexit vote, but at the end of the day, I don't think that's a choice that British politicians will make because they cannot leave the decision unaddressed, right? And conservatives, they were divided whether to remain or leave. I think as time went by, um, the the voices for pro-Brexit will only become larger and larger. That will ultimately become inevitable for them to really leave. And perhaps it is only after they leave that they realize that they might not have left. So maybe if David Cameron did not decided to hold the referendum, because I think one narrative is that David Cameron decided to hold the referendum because he knew that the result was not gonna leave, and he just wanted to do it to appear to be a democratic process and to appease those who wanted to do so. But yeah, yeah. So I also think that you mentioned right, Rishi Sunak probably couldn't do much based on what he has inherited. The Conservatives were indeed in power for 14 years, and that is already quite a long time for a democracy like the United Kingdom. And plus, they also experienced the pandemic, which major countries saw their leadership and their government changing, election after the pandemic. So so it's probably really inevitable, even though if Liz Truss's financial plan did go by her plan, maybe it was still inevitable. That's what I think. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, so we should move on.
Yeah, to the later soon.
Yeah, so before we discuss Keir Starmer's policy or his premiership, maybe we should first have a look at the 2024 election. So the result of the election was pretty shocking. It was really a landslide in terms of the House of Commons seats count. For the Labours, I think they got 411 seats, and the Conservatives they got some hundred seats. I don't know. Uh,
30 or 40, I think.
yeah, yeah, and the Liberal Democrats they got 70 or so, I think, and the Reform got five, and despite Reform having a much higher vote share. So yeah, we should talk about what happened during the campaign. So not much happened during the campaign because a lot of people knew that the Labour was certainly going to take over the government. And there are basically two events that might have influenced the outcome. The first is that Rishi Sunak decided to call the election. I think it was early, because he could have waited longer until the 5 year period, which is the longest period before you have to hold a general election. But no, he decided to hold the election early, maybe to try to minimize the loss, but that did not pan well as well. Uh,
I think he felt that, he was doing a decent job and the economy was up. The numbers that were recently put out before he called the election in
yeah,
May, I think, were quite decent. So he thought that, it was as good a situation as they were going to get because they were most likely going to lose as well. Uh, and maybe he thought it would be a good idea to, surprise everyone because, nobody knew he was going to make the decision. I think even his closest advisors said they were, a little surprised. Um, Maybe adapt. But I think he basically chose to, try it because he knew that, they were going to lose anyway.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
So there are two, I said, defining moments in the campaign. The first is that the Scottish Nationalist Party, which has been performing quite strong since I think around 2014, uh, in the Scotland part of the United Kingdom, because there was the pro independence movement and all that. But their leadership was caught in a scandal, something related to fraud. So that that party was hit hard during the election. And another defining event was that I think Rishi Sunak tried to bring back the national service, and many criticized it. So bring back national service basically to have teenagers or young adults to serve in the military for 1 year or some period of time, and many criticized for a electoral some kind of just to appeal to the voters, perhaps the older voters, and it did not really go well as well. And yeah, so the conservatives lose large. But on the other hand, Labour, although they won 411 seats, that's definitely a lot. That's one of their largest majorities in the time. Their victory was described as fragile. So what this means is that their actual vote share. So I think in the last election, so the 2019 election, their vote share was 32.7% of the popular vote. And the 2024 election only gives them 33.7% of the popular vote. And why did they win such a majority? It is mainly because a lot of the conservative voters and part of the labor voters, they have shifted to reform. And ideologically speaking, reform was closer to the conservatives than the labor. So in a lot of places, the conservatives were essentially sharing votes with the reform, so they did not perform well. And so, yeah, so that's basically the main takeaways of the 2024 British general election. And when you look at the electoral map, uh, what Labour made the main inroads is, in fact, in the more rural areas. Of course, they maintained their lead in the more urban areas, such as the Manchester and area, and also the Greater London area. But what they really make inroads is in the northern, more deprived area of northern East England, which they traditionally call a red wall, similar to what political commentaries refer to the Great Lake areas in the United States as the Blue Wall. It was kind of also the industrialized region of the United Kingdom, where there used to be a lot of factories, but in the 21st century, the UK got into post-industrialization and they got deindustrialized. And so in the 2010 elections, those deindustrialized people, they lost their jobs, they shifted to the conservatives. But in the 2024 election, although they are deprived, so a lot of them actually shifted to the reform, and reform helped it to basically pull conservative down from the first poll. So actually, Labour was able to snag kind of a victory despite uh a lot of people might be quite right leaning or like pro right party in those regions, so that's where it won. Yeah, so any commentaries?
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, I think this is a characteristic of the first past the post uh, electoral system that
Mhm.
the UK uses, right? You don't have to get an overwhelming majority to win an overwhelming majority in parliament. You only have to, as long as you win, theoretically each constituent by one vote, you can win everything. Um, I think I read a paper or piece or article that said, this system, it's supposed to yield clear majorities because,
Yeah.
you know, they're supposed to be able to, larger parties are supposed to be able to win more easily in constituents because they only have to like win a clear majority in each constituent. Um, but very few, that hasn't happened that much in the past 14 years. Um,
No.
Theresa, the only two that have won a clear majority for their parties is Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer, as we've mentioned before, they won because people were fed up with what was happening, and they wanted change, and so
And
they
reform
turned.
was rising
Yeah,
really quick. That
yeah,
was
yeah.
also, yeah.
Yeah, but I just think, reform still wasn't that well established, so they didn't really, or they weren't really that big of a threat in the last election, but they're obviously going to be a pretty big threat in the next election. They're doing very well in the polls, and people are just very angry with what's going on. Keir Starmer didn't solve much of their problems either, or at least, he wasn't a good enough messenger to tell them that, he solved some of their problems. So everyone's, of course, turning to many of the voters, especially um, ones that are in left behind areas, relatively left behind areas, and areas that
Mhm.
aren't doing so well. They're turning to reform, and that's, I think, one thing that the new Prime Minister Andy Burnham is trying to do with many of his policies. He's trying to win back these voters that feel they've been left behind by the country. Um, and I think that's a very smart idea because that's going to help the country also, but of course also help Labour and hurt their most direct competitor in reform.
Mhm. Yeah, so as we mentioned, the UK is getting much more fragmented in terms of political party makeup. But I think the reasons for why we're not seeing a majority in the 2010s and in the 2020s are actually different. So the UK, they have a lot of regional powers. It's really a localized part of politics where there are devolution in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and in Wales. So there are a lot of regional parties in play. And in the 2010s, it's basically the power of those regional parties, where the Scottish National Party are able to dominate Scotland, and I think Sinn Féin and some other Northern Irish parties are able to deliver the votes here. So it was not really a two-party system, and because like local interest has been playing a huge role in UK politics, and people's people identify with their local with their regional identities. Like people in Northern Ireland, they more likely to vote for parties in Northern Ireland than for Labour or for Conservative. So that's why we are seeing a lot of home parliaments in 2010s. But in 2020s, I think if we are seeing home parliament in the future, it was more likely because of political polarization, where we have seen reform as a rising party on the radical right, and there are also kind of more leftist parties that try to outflank the Labour, namely the Green Party, and a recent party that's Jeremy Corbyn, which is formerly the party leader of Labour, yeah, after Ed Miliband. Yeah, so it's really an interesting dynamic playing out. And in terms, I think you also mentioned that Labour, they might as well try to kind of capture those left behind era people, but I don't really think that's quite a smart strategy because uh, ultimately I don't think it is actually rather possible to capture that. They have no employment as they're really fed up with what they're experiencing now, and they are strongly anti-immigration, and they are also fed up with the culture war. And I think I've also wrote on my slide that labor is actually caught up in the middle. So like for the major developed countries, they've experienced post deindustrialization after they've been into a post-industrial society. So formerly those left-wing parties mainly uh, relies on the power of the labor forces of the blue collar workers. But as they are deindustrialized and as the service sector grows, the left wing parties are branding themselves as a new left. That they are ditching from the trade unions, the support from trade unions, as they are indeed targeting a more intellectual. They are having those cultural agenda such as more equity and more care and more DEIs, and that's what the new left is about. So I think actually if the labor was to target those left behinders, it will cause the party to overstretch itself in terms of its political and ideology agendas, and I don't think that's a really smart strategy. I think what instead it should do is it should either choose to target itself towards the more urbanized intellectual part of the UK, where people perhaps, although they might not want to increase their tax, but they might see reforms, anti-immigration, or their um, some of the rhetoric as a bit extreme, as a bit anti-democratic, or as a bit non-humanitarian. I think that is the dynamics that I'm seeing in UK politics right now.
Yeah, I would like to, slightly push back on that. I think that what Andy Burnham is doing is he is trying to capture the left behind. You look at as many of his new policies and his frame and how he frames himself, how he presents himself. He presents himself, as a northerner who understands what it's like to be left behind. Um, he understands what it's like to be, or at least he portrays himself as one who understands what it's like to be living in, deindustrialized countries. And many of his deindustrialized regions, that previously relied heavily on industrialization, and many of his policies that he's unveiled in his, first few weeks as prime minister have been focused on this. He's talked about devolution, giving power back to the these left behind people, bringing power, taking power out of Westminster and into, every postcode in the land, as he said, into especially Manchester in the north, where he comes from. Number 10 in the north is obviously a symbolic institution that symbolizes that. Also, he's talked about reindustrialization, right? He's spoken in his many speeches, whether it was his labor speech, his victory speech, or in many of his speeches, he's talked about reindustrialization, how he believes that the United Kingdom took a series of wrong turns at the end of, in the 1980s when Thatcher deindustrialized everything. He thought that was wrong. He thinks that, he should bring back, industrialization. And he also has policies to give these workers breathing space, as he calls it. His first action in office was he said he was going to end rough sleeping, and he's trying to do things to really improve their lives, these voters. And I mean, I personally think it's not that bad of an idea because what these workers want, or these people who are left behind, uh, the constituents, what they want is they want to be seen again. They want to be seen again. They also want their lives to improve, even if marginally. And that's what Andy Burnham is doing. And it's great that and it's great that it's Andy Burnham that's doing it because, he seems like one of them. And, they won't think that he's condescending, but rather someone who's really trying to help them. And, for what you talked about, aiming and targeting the well-educated. I personally think the well-educated, they hate reform, or they dislike reform and its agenda enough that they will vote for the party that has the largest, possibility of defeating reform. And, they might think that's Labor and they'll just vote for them, right? While on the other hand, it is precisely the people that are left behind, that feel left behind and, feel, anti-immigrant and everything like that, that that are, powering reform surge. And if Labor can take people away from that, uh, they not only bolster themselves and increase, their own share of votes, but they also hurt their most, right now, at least their strongest competitor, and that's going to help their election results a lot. And also, about the regional parties thing, I think the Westminster system or the UK system is still a two-party, mostly a two-party majority system. Yeah, there are regional powers in Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland and Wales, but their influence is limited to those regions, right? In at least like before, like for example, in the 2010s, there was still a very clear two-party government between the two major parties, conservative and Labor. I think it's been quite some time since a new party has come onto the scene, and Reform, of course, has been coming onto the scene as of late. But I think apart from that, mostly the
But
UK has
yeah,
been a
but
tight.
the 2010 government was a coalition government, right? It was
Yeah,
one
but I
between
mean,
conservative, yeah. I think
yeah, but
most would characterize this as a somehow a 2.5 party system, which I thought was a bit weird, but I think it do some of
Okay.
it right. I think it's not as two-party as perhaps we're seeing in the United States or
Yeah, that's definitely not that not that,
yeah.
not that polar, not that, two party.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with the policies. Yeah, Andy Berman is indeed doing a lot of these policies, but then what I'm arguing is that I think that the coalition of voters that the Labor is having right now, they have like incompatible needs and wants, you know. I don't think it's a wise move to maintain the this coalition. And the reason is that I don't think it is really possible for them to really like. I know probably like devolution or bringing attention or bringing perhaps some power away from London might help in the short term, but I think in the long term, what they care is about their job, is about their employment. And currently, I do not see a role where the UK really reindustrialize. Like despite Trump's
Yeah,
tariff, like yeah, Trump tried to bring that back, and the US has a massive internal market. Like people in
yeah,
Michigan, people in Wisconsin are still unemployed, and people in Ohio are still unemployed. And
yeah. Uh,
yeah,
yeah, I'm
so I
not.
just
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, so I just don't see how like they could actually fully capture the attention the votes of those left behind areas because there are scientific literature and I have been researching that a bit where like there is really a strong correlation between deindustrialized regions and people's inclination to vote for radical right parties. So yeah, I think if like Labour tries to soften its stand, tries to harden its stance on immigration more, for example, to appeal to those labor to those workers in northeast England, is only gonna alienate there are more urban, more intellectual voters, perhaps in London or perhaps in Manchester, and
Yeah, but
maybe to either to the Greens or to the Democrats or to the party, your party, by Jeremy Corbyn, further on the left. So
yeah, but I don't. Yeah, of course. First, on the point of deindustrialization or reindustrialization, of course, I don't think either that the United Kingdom or any industrialized, deindustrialized country for that matter can achieve reindustrialization. Just doesn't seem realistic. But I mean, it's politics, right? He wants to, he has to, he wants to, he has to at least say these things and make them believe, right? Make these workers believe. And I'm sure, he'll probably do some things to reindustrialize, but of course, yeah, I don't think he's going to be able to fully industrialize at all. Um, and on
yeah,
immigration, I don't think he's been touching immigration really. I don't think I think in his interview with BBC he said that he's going to be reviewing the previous administration's immigration rules about the increasing of time that it takes for an immigrant to receive the right to infinite leave, basically permanent residency. Um, and I think it's because, the United Kingdom, it needs labor. It needs especially skilled labor. Um, because, for example, the NHS system, it needs skilled labor from around the world because many of the European um, nurses and doctors that worked there during, when they were part of the European Union have left since. Um, so, I mean, yeah, I guess he is trying to yeah, I think he is trying to build a coalition, and in some ways I think it is true that they are incompatible with each other. But I mean, then again, I think like the things that he's been doing with devolution and calling for reindustrialization, they aren't really going to alienate the urban or the more well-educated or more southern voters, while they are going to make some inroads with the people who believe they have been left behind. And I don't think he's going to really touch immigration and make immigration much harder. And frankly, I don't think like the people who are left behind, they really hate immigrants. It's just that they believe that immigrants are taking their jobs. And they blame their all of their issues on immigrants, right? It's they're like the immigrants are the scapegoat. Um, if they can, get better living standards or, they feel more seen, they feel more important, and, maybe they get more jobs, then they are, they're going to be okay with, labor being decent to immigrants or not like restricting immigrants that much. So I think it's certainly possible. And I mean, I again believe that as long as he doesn't do, terrible things in terms of immigration, he won't really alienate people with other things like, devolution, reindustrialization, because they also quite seem quite common sense. And I mean, for example, the more urbanized and more educated people also probably understand that, oh yeah, it's probably good to be, for there to be more devolution and stuff like that. So I mean, I think it certainly has the possibility to succeed. And he doesn't need it to be like that good. He only needs it to be sufficient to help him win the next election, which, I mean, honestly, reform, it has many it has glaring issues, and many people are very unwilling to vote for reform.
Yeah, yeah. I do think that perhaps devolution is quite a good a policy, and perhaps those in London will not boycott. But again, I think immigration it is really one of the most, I would say, most divisive issue right now, and its importance, I would say, is perhaps more than devolution or any economic stuff. And I think it is really the cultural aspect or the cultural ideology that really makes this coalition incompatible. Yeah, I think in, especially in Europe and in especially in United Kingdom, immigration is not about whether they have job, whether they have economic security or not. It's more about their culture, right? It's more about their heritage and their identity. Because in fact, in where as we mentioned in Northeast England, where there are lots of less educated, formerly blue collar workers, there aren't really a lot of like colored immigrants there. They are not really taking their job. Is
Mm.
Yeah, so immigrants are more of threat to their identity rather than their livelihood because there aren't really that much immigrants. Immigrants are perhaps in London and more coastal areas near France, let's say. So and yeah, I think the gist is that those blue collar workers hate immigrants not because they took away their job, because they are colored, because you could say they're probably racist to some extent, because this threats the identity of the Protestants and white England. That's a problem. I'm sure if they're having immigrants, perhaps from France or Germany, perhaps those blue collar workers would not care that much, but the immigrants are from India, they're from Pakistan, they're from Malaysia, they're from Indonesia. So that's a problem for them. And I also
Yeah,
think the same goes for other cultural issues, say climate change and gender issues, and yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, I still do believe that, I still think the main reason is that, why people are anti-immigrant is because they aren't doing that well themselves, and they believe that immigrants have taken their jobs and stuff like that. I think if they were doing well, I think most of the people that are anti-immigrant probably wouldn't be that anti-immigrant, and the few that are still, or the people that are still immigrants, anti-immigrants, maybe that's because they are just racist. I personally think that all these talks about cultural erosion and stuff like that, they're all excuses because in the society today you can't say you hate someone because of the skin of color of their skin, but you can say, at least it's slightly more accepted to say that, oh, I don't want them to come in because I want to protect my cultural identity. So I personally think that many of the people that are anti-immigrant are just racist, and for example, cultural arguments, they're just excuses to make their arguments more palatable to the common public.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
Mm.
probably they're just racist, but still I still think that the labor is having a coalition of incompatible preference right now, kind
Yeah,
of.
that's probably true as well.
So I think that's all for today, right?
Mm.
Yeah, we'll probably see you next episode.